A man will cheat on you if those words alone carry heat, don't they? They stir something ancient in us. Fear, shame, maybe even a bitter "I knew it." But before we armor up or point fingers, I want to ask you something deeper. What story are you telling yourself about why people betray? Because betrayal in love, in friendship, in family is never just about what they did. It's about what it cracked open in us. Let me be clear. Cheating is not your fault, but ignoring the warning signs, that's your responsibility. And that's what we're here to talk about. So let's get honest. Let's talk about the silence before the storm, the things we knew but didn't want to know, the places where we were starving for connection but stayed quiet to keep the peace. A man will cheat on you if he's terrified of being seen. He confuses control with love. He doesn't know how to sit in discomfort, his or yours. He uses shame as a compass instead of truth. He's more loyal to his image than to your intimacy. He's disconnected from his own worth and projects that emptiness onto you. And sometimes he cheats because he knows you're strong enough to survive it, and he's not. Now, that doesn't mean it's okay. It's not okay. But when we name what's real, we take our power back. So if you've been betrayed, listen closely. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are not unlovable. You were never meant to hold a relationship together with silence and self-abandonment. If love demands that you shrink, it's not love, it's performance. If you have to lose your voice to keep him, you've already lost yourself. We do not negotiate our self-worth at the table of someone else's unhealed pain. Stand in your truth. Stand in your story. And remember this, you are not hard to love. You are hard to manipulate. And that difference, that's everything. Betrayal, it's one of those words that hits in the gut before it ever makes it to the head. It lands heavy. And when we experience it, especially in love, the first question we tend to ask is, what did I do wrong? It's reflexive. We search for our fault line. We scan the past for a moment we could have said something different, loved better, tried harder. But here's the truth, betrayal is not your fault. The choice to cheat, to deceive, to break that bond, that choice belongs fully to the person who made it. But what is on us, and this is the part we don't always want to talk about, is how often we ignore what we already knew. So let's sit in the discomfort of that for a second. Let's talk about the knowing, because deep down, most of us have it. That soft whisper, that small twinge in the gut, that moment when the conversation didn't add up, but we laughed it off. When we saw the distance in his eyes, but we said, he's just tired. When intimacy became routine, or worse, went missing, and we explained it away with stress, work, kids, anything but what it really was. We talk a lot about intuition, but not enough about how often we mute it to avoid the pain of confronting truth. We don't ignore red flags because we're weak or naive. We ignore them because we hope, because we're wired for connection and terrified of losing it. And when love is on the line, when we've invested our time, our dreams, our identity in a relationship, it's safer in the short term to rationalize than to risk rupture. We convince ourselves that noticing something would mean breaking everything. And so we choose peace, even if it's the fake kind, over clarity. But clarity always comes. It just hurts more when we've spent months or years pretending we didn't see it coming. There's a cost to self-abandonment, and it's steep. Every time we silence that inner voice, the one tugging at us when something feels off, we chip away at our own self-trust. That's what betrayal really destroys. Not just trust in others, but trust in ourselves. Why didn't I listen? Why didn't I leave sooner? How could I not see it? These are the questions that haunt us long after the apology or the absence of one. And they don't go away until we face what we were avoiding in the first place. The truth that we knew more than we were willing to admit. Here's what's hard to say, but even harder to live with sometimes. We choose denial because it keeps the fantasy alive. The fantasy of who we wanted him to be, of what we hoped the relationship could become. We fall in love with potential, not patterns. But people don't live in their potential. They live in their choices. And if we're not honest about the choices someone is consistently making, disrespect, disengagement, dishonesty, we're not in a relationship with them. We're in a relationship with a version of them we've created to protect our hearts from breaking. But that protection doesn't work. Eventually, the cracks show, the distance grows, the betrayal comes, and we're left not just with pain, but with a deep sense of shame, not for what they did, but for what we tolerated. That's where the real grief lives, not just in losing them, but in realizing we lost ourselves trying to keep them. That's why betrayal cuts so deep. It touches every part of us that wanted so badly to believe love alone was enough to keep someone honest. So when we say, it's not your fault, that's not a pass to bypass the work. It's a permission slip to stop blaming yourself so you can start trusting yourself again. Because the red flags weren't just warnings about him. They were invitations to come home to yourself, to speak when you were quiet, to act when you froze, to believe that your inner knowing, that whisper, that ache, that tightening in your chest, was always telling the truth, even when he wasn't. And when you start honoring that truth, not just in hindsight, but in real time, you stop begging for scraps of attention and start demanding full presence. You stop asking, why did he do this to me? And start asking, what part of me believed I had to settle for this? That's not self-blame, that's self-awareness. And it's the first step toward healing that doesn't just help you survive betrayal, but helps you rise from it, rooted, whole, and no longer willing to ignore what you already know. One of the hardest truths to sit with, and I mean really sit with, without flinching or numbing or running, is this. Sometimes the person who betrays you does love you. Not in a healthy way, not in a whole way, but in the best way they know how, which often isn't nearly enough. That's a devastating kind of grief. Because it would be so much easier, wouldn't it, if the reason someone hurt you was because they didn't care, if they were cold, unfeeling, malicious, but more often than not, they cared. They just weren't capable. Cheating is not always a sign of hatred or indifference. It's often the opposite, a deep, unconscious expression of fear. Fear of closeness, fear of being known, fear of being inadequate. It's an escape hatch disguised as desire. And it has less to do with you and more to do with their inability to handle what intimacy demands: vulnerability, truth, emotional presence. These are not light things. They ask you to sit with your own discomfort and someone else's without fixing or fleeing. And emotional immaturity doesn't know how to do that. It knows how to react. It knows how to seek relief. It doesn't know how to stay. That's the difference between love and emotional capacity. Someone can love you deeply and still lack the skills to treat that love with honor. You can matter to someone and still be hurt by them, because love without maturity becomes dangerous. It becomes unstable. It shifts based on convenience, on mood, on ego. It doesn't know how to commit, to repair, to accountability, to honesty. It knows how to perform affection, how to say the right things, how to mirror what you need in the moment. But when real relationship demands show up, conflict, boredom, emotional transparency, the mask slips. This is where so many people get stuck in the aftermath of betrayal. They remember the love. They remember the good days, the laughter, the connection that felt real, because it was real to a point. And they think, if he loved me, how could he do this? That question will keep you spiraling if you don't shift it. Because the truth is, he could love you and still hurt you. Not because you weren't enough, but because his love never grew past his wounds. And if someone doesn't know how to manage their own emotional world, they'll leak that chaos onto everyone around them, even the people they claim to love most. Emotional immaturity is sneaky. It often shows up in charming ways: humor, flirtation, spontaneity, all the things we're taught to romanticize. But when things get hard, when communication breaks down, when life gets real, that's when maturity steps in, or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, that person starts looking for exits. Not always physical exits, sometimes mental, emotional ones, disconnection, deflection, or yes, infidelity. Because cheating is rarely about the other person being better or more attractive or more exciting. It's about control. It's about the thrill of avoiding what's hard. And it's about trying to reclaim a sense of power in a life where you feel emotionally unequipped. None of this is an excuse. Immaturity doesn't justify betrayal, but understanding it helps us stop internalizing someone else's lack of growth as a reflection of our worth. That's what gets so tangled in heartbreak. We take their actions as evidence that we were lacking, that if we were prettier, sexier, easier to love, more secure, they wouldn't have strayed. But that's not how it works. People don't cheat because you're not enough. They cheat because they don't know how to be enough for themselves, and so they search for external validation to patch an internal void. But no one can love you well while avoiding their own reflection. This is the work right here, not just healing from the betrayal, but detangling your identity from someone else's immaturity, seeing their choices for what they are, not personal attacks, but personal limitations. That doesn't make the pain any less real, but it makes it clearer, and clarity is powerful. Clarity lets you grieve what you lost, yes, but also what was never really there, not in the way you hoped, not in the way you deserved. Emotional maturity doesn't just love you, it takes responsibility for how it shows up. And anything less than that is not your fault. It's a reflection of where they stopped growing. Shame is one of the most corrosive forces in the human experience. It doesn't just whisper, "You made a mistake." It screams, "You are the mistake." It tells you to hide, to armor up, to pretend. And for so many men, shame becomes the language of their inner world long before they even know the word for it. It begins early with lessons passed down through silence and sideways glances, that vulnerability is weakness, that emotion is dangerous, that real men don't talk about fear or failure or the ache of not being enough. And so they learn to bury it, to perform strength instead of living truth. And buried shame doesn't disappear. It festers. When a man is drowning in shame, he doesn't look for connection. He looks for escape, because connection requires being seen. And being seen when you're carrying the belief that you are inherently unworthy feels unbearable. So he builds walls. He tells half-truths. He smiles when he's numb. He disconnects from his own needs, then resents anyone who tries to get close. And when secrecy becomes a survival strategy, honesty starts to feel like a threat. That's when betrayal creeps in. Not because he's evil, not because he's incapable of love, but because he's spent years, sometimes decades, hiding from himself. Secrecy becomes a shelter and a weapon. It gives him control. It lets him stay in charge of the story, but it also keeps him stuck. Because no real relationship can thrive in the dark, love needs light. It needs truth. And a man who is too ashamed to be fully known will sabotage intimacy the moment it gets too close. He'll start creating distance, often unconsciously, a little less affection here, a little more distraction there. And when that's not enough to quiet the fear, he'll look for relief in places where he doesn't have to feel vulnerable. Sometimes that means cheating, not out of lust, but out of fear. Here's the part that stings. The betrayal often has very little to do with the person being betrayed. It's not about your body, your personality, your value. It's about the war he's been fighting inside himself. A war he never told you about, a war he might not even realize he's in, but the casualties are real, and you're left holding the wreckage of something you didn't break. That's the devastation of secrecy. It isolates the person who's carrying it, but it also deeply wounds the people around them, because secrets are never silent. They speak through behavior, through distance, through denial. We live in a culture that tells men their worth is tied to their performance. Be successful, be strong, be in control. And when they fall short of those impossible standards, which everyone eventually does, they don't know where to go with the disappointment. They don't know how to say, I feel lost, I feel like a fraud, I feel like I'm failing. So instead of turning toward vulnerability, they turn toward numbing behaviors, drinking, working, flirting, lying, anything that lets them avoid the shame. But avoiding shame never heals it. It just delays the breakdown. And often by the time the truth surfaces, the damage is already done. When someone is living in shame, they can't show up fully. They can't hold your heart because they've never learned how to hold their own. And that doesn't just lead to emotional distance, it leads to deception. Because when your identity is built on looking put together, you will do anything to protect that image, even if it means hurting the people you love. That's the thing about secrecy. It demands sacrifice. It asks you to give up authenticity for approval, connection for control, and eventually it collapses under its own weight. But it usually takes someone else's heartbreak to expose the truth. This is why doing our inner work is not a luxury, it's a necessity, especially for men who've been taught that emotional honesty is dangerous. Until that shame is named, it runs the show. Until that secrecy is dismantled, it keeps intimacy just out of reach. And if you're in relationship with someone who's carrying that hidden shame, you will feel it in the silence, in the lies, in the betrayal, not because you caused it, but because you were close enough to threaten the mask. And when love threatens the mask, the man who's still ruled by shame will choose the mask. Every time. Discomfort is part of being human. And yet we live in a culture that treats discomfort like a disease, something to avoid, something to numb, something to run from. But discomfort is information. It's truth knocking at the door. It's the space between what's real and what we wish was real. And how we respond to it tells us everything about how we live, love, and lead. The problem is most people, especially men raised on the myth of invulnerability, aren't taught how to feel discomfort. They're taught to fix it, escape it, overpower it. So when discomfort shows up in relationships, and it always does, it can feel like a threat instead of an invitation to grow. This inability to sit in discomfort is often where betrayal begins. Because intimacy isn't easy. Love brings up every part of ourselves we've hidden, repressed, or refused to name. Being truly seen can be terrifying when you've spent your life performing strength. And when conflict arises, when emotions surge, when things get messy, as they inevitably do, someone who hasn't learned to tolerate discomfort won't lean in. They'll check out, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, but always in a way that avoids facing what's painful. And often, that escape route leads straight to distraction, flirting, attention-seeking, cheating, not because they don't care, but because staying present in hard moments requires emotional muscles they've never been taught to build. It takes strength to say, I feel overwhelmed, or I'm scared I'm not enough, or I don't know how to fix this, but I want to stay. That's vulnerability. That's courage. But if all someone has ever known is avoiding pain, then discomfort feels like failure. And in a desperate attempt to feel something other than powerless, they'll seek something, anything that makes them feel in control again. Distraction isn't about desire, it's about escape. This is why cheating is often less about attraction and more about emotional avoidance. It's not always about the other person being better, more exciting, or more available. It's about choosing something that doesn't require effort, depth, or presence. It's about avoiding the mirror that your relationship is holding up. Because real love demands reflection, it demands honesty. It says, let's sit in the mess together. But if someone doesn't know how to sit in their own pain, they will not sit in yours. They will turn away from the hard conversations. They will look for a shortcut back to ease, even if it costs you everything. We romanticize the idea of spontaneity, thrill, and passion. But what we don't talk about is how often those things are used to mask deeper emotional voids. A man who hasn't learned to process his own emotions will confuse boredom with failure. He'll mistake conflict for incompatibility. He'll interpret vulnerability as weakness in you and in himself. And instead of digging in, staying grounded, and doing the work of connection, he'll look outward for affirmation, for distraction. Not because he's bad, but because that's the only way he knows to soothe the discomfort of not knowing how to show up emotionally. The danger of distraction is that it feels like relief, but only for a moment. It's a hit of validation, a spark of novelty, a brief illusion of power, but it doesn't solve anything. In fact, it multiplies the pain, because now the discomfort isn't just internal, it's relational. It's betrayal layered on top of avoidance. And what could have been a healing moment, a conversation, a pause, a shared struggle, becomes a rupture. Not because the relationship was broken, but because someone chose not to face what was breaking inside them. And here's the truth we have to sit with. Love will always bring discomfort. Growth will always bring friction. That's not a sign that something's wrong. It's a sign that something's real. But real requires presence. Real requires choosing to stay, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And if a man hasn't learned how to be still in his own discomfort, he will leave you, emotionally, mentally, or physically, the moment you stop feeling easy, not because you're difficult, but because no one ever taught him how to stay when things aren't simple. Accountability is not about blame, it's about ownership. It's the quiet courage to say, I did that, I caused harm, I have work to do. But that kind of truth-telling requires a level of emotional maturity and self-awareness that many people, especially those who've been taught to equate mistakes with shame, never learn. So instead of facing their impact, they rewrite the story, not because they're inherently malicious, but because their sense of self is too fragile to hold both the guilt and the responsibility. When a man lacks accountability, he doesn't just avoid the truth, he bends it. And he bends it in a way that makes you easier to blame than himself. It starts subtly. He forgets key details. He downplays how things happened. He uses phrases like, you were too sensitive, or you always blow things out of proportion. And that's not just defensiveness, that's narrative manipulation. It's an unwillingness to look in the mirror, so he holds it up to you instead. And slowly you start to question your memory, your perception, your reality. That's the real cost of accountability avoidance. It's not just that he doesn't own what he did, it's that he makes you responsible for his actions. That's gaslighting dressed up as confusion. Without accountability, relationships can't be repaired because repair requires truth. It requires someone to say, I see what I did, I understand the hurt, and I want to make it right. But a man who can't hold space for his own wrongdoing will skip that step. He'll jump to defensiveness. He'll say, I said I was sorry, what more do you want? Or worse, he'll paint you as bitter, dramatic, unforgiving. He'll weaponize your pain to protect his ego. And in doing so, he'll cause a second injury, not just the betrayal itself, but the denial that it ever really mattered. This rewriting of the story becomes a strategy for emotional survival. Because for someone who's never learned to separate self-worth from perfection, admitting fault feels like annihilation. So he shifts the spotlight. He makes it about your tone, your timing, your reaction. Suddenly he's the victim. He was pressured, he was misunderstood, he felt neglected. All of that might be true, and still it does not excuse betrayal. But when someone doesn't understand accountability, nuance is terrifying. They need a clear villain to avoid looking at their own shadow. And if you're the one who got hurt, guess who the villain becomes? This pattern is so common and so painful because it leaves you isolated in your truth. You know what happened, you know the timeline, the details, the emotional cost, but now you're not just healing from the event, you're fighting for the right to name it. And that fight will exhaust you. It will drain your spirit. Because trying to convince someone to own their impact when they're committed to self-protection is a losing game. You cannot make someone tell the truth when they've built their safety on denial, and you shouldn't have to. Here's what makes accountability powerful and rare. It requires vulnerability. It requires sitting with the guilt, the discomfort, the regret, and choosing to stay present. That's what growth looks like. Not perfection, but the willingness to repair, the willingness to say, I got it wrong, and I'm not going to hide from that. But many men have never been shown that model. They've been taught that admitting fault is weakness, that being wrong is shameful. And so instead of leaning in, they lash out, they rewrite, they reframe. And they often do it with so much conviction that you begin to doubt your own story. And this is where self-trust becomes everything. You must anchor yourself in your knowing, even when he denies, even when he spins, even when he insists that you're the problem. You can hold compassion for his pain and still hold boundaries around yours. You can understand his wounds without absorbing his projection. And you can walk away from someone who refuses to take accountability, not because you're punishing him, but because you decided to stop punishing yourself for needing honesty, repair, and responsibility. Because at the end of the day, love without accountability is not love, it's performance. And you deserve the real thing. There is a difference between being loved and feeling lovable. You can be deeply loved, wildly adored, fully chosen, and still feel hollow inside. Because if your sense of worth is tethered to how others see you, love becomes something you chase, not something you hold. And for many men, that chase begins early. They're taught to measure themselves by what they achieve, what they produce, how many people want them, how impressive they look doing it. And so worth becomes external. It lives outside of them. And that is dangerous because anything that lives outside of you can be taken away. And that is dangerous because anything that lives outside of you can be taken away. When a man's worth depends on being validated, desired, admired, he will always be performing. Even in relationships that feel safe, even with partners who are deeply present, because deep down, he's not looking to connect, he's looking to win. He wants to be chosen, yes, but not just by you, by the world, by strangers, by anyone who can affirm what he cannot affirm in himself. So when that newness fades, when love settles into stability, when the validation stops feeling exciting, he starts looking, not necessarily because he wants to leave, but because he doesn't know how to stay without applause. This is why cheating for some men isn't about sex, it's about significance. It's about being seen in a way that feels powerful, desired, irresistible, not because they don't already have someone who sees them, but because they need the constant hit of being wanted. That need is bottomless when it's driven by insecurity. No matter how much love you pour in, it leaks out. Because love given to someone who can't receive it becomes invisible. And the more invisible it feels, the more they search for visibility in the eyes of others. When worth is external, presence becomes impossible because the man isn't rooted in who he is. He's lost in who he thinks he needs to be. He's scanning the room. He's wondering who's watching. He's comparing, measuring, posturing. And that kind of restless energy is exhausting for both of you because you're not in a relationship with a whole person. You're in a relationship with someone who's constantly auditioning for approval, for attention, for something that feels like home, but never lasts long enough to anchor him. This is the heartbreak of loving someone who lives in a state of emotional scarcity. You can give your best, your softness, your loyalty, and still feel like you're competing with a world that doesn't even know him because he's chasing a feeling that has nothing to do with you. He wants to feel enough. And until he finds that within himself, he will never fully land in a relationship. Not really. He might show up. He might say the right things. He might even believe them in the moment. But the moment passes and he's off again. Searching, scanning, needing to be chosen by someone else, somewhere else, for something he doesn't even understand. That's what makes this kind of betrayal so confusing. It doesn't always look like disconnection. Sometimes he's still attentive, still affectionate, still present in the ways you're told to look for. But emotionally, he's elsewhere. He's rehearsing a role. He's playing a part. And underneath all of it is a boy who never learned that he was worthy without proving it, without performing, without someone outside him saying, "You matter." So he collects compliments like armor. He flirts not because he's falling in love, but because he needs the reminder that he could, that he's still wanted, that he still has it. But here's the thing. Love cannot compete with emptiness, not sustainably. If a man hasn't built an identity that can hold stillness, silence, and self-worth without an audience, he will not know how to receive real love. Because real love isn't always exciting. It's steady, it's quiet, it's deep. And for someone addicted to external validation, that kind of love can feel like absence. So they keep searching, not because their definition of enough was broken long before you ever showed up. And unless they do the inner work of rebuilding it, they will keep looking for something that was never missing outside of them, it was missing within. Here's what I know for sure. You are not responsible for healing someone who refuses to do the work. You can love someone deeply and still choose to walk away when that love begins to cost you your peace, your clarity, your dignity. The moment you start shrinking, doubting, or disappearing just to keep a man comfortable in his dysfunction, that's the moment you know this isn't love, this is survival. Real intimacy requires truth. It requires emotional accountability. It requires someone who doesn't just want to be chosen, but is ready to choose you every day with honesty, presence, and depth. And if a man isn't there yet, if he's still hiding behind shame, still chasing validation, still avoiding the hard parts, let him go find himself. That's not your burden to carry. That's his path to walk. You deserve someone who doesn't need to be reminded of your value, someone who sees it, honors it, and matches it with their own. You deserve a partner, not a project, a safe place, not a guessing game. And the bravest thing you can ever do is stop proving your worth to someone who was never ready to receive it in the first place. Let him cheat the version of himself he refuses to heal. But you choose to stay loyal to the version of you that knows she deserves more. That's not bitterness, that's boundaries, that's power, and that's love. Real love, starting with yourself.